Hello and welcome to Bedhead Books. Today is going to be a double whammy. We are going to be talking about David Stubbs' Mars by 1980, the story of electronic music, and Daniel Warner's Live Wires, a history of electronic music. Confusing titles, maybe. As you can see, one volume is more slender than the other one, but don't let that fool you. David Stubbs is a British music journalist, whereas Daniel Warner is an American music professor. So you get two slightly different perspectives on the same topic here. So let's start with Mars by 1980. So this book does take more of a cultural look at the development of electronics in music, right from the early days of the phonograph through to the development of player pianos, the early synthesizers. It goes right the way through to synth pop duos, including Suicide, who I wasn't very familiar with, so it's good to have a little bit about them. In general, he does bring up a lot of forgotten figures from the history of electronic music, like Delia Derbyshire, who actually assisted with creating the Doctor Who theme tune. It's good to have acknowledgement of these forgotten figures who carried out these experiments, because there was a lot of things that, of course, went wrong, and events where they wanted to show demonstrations of this technology and inevitably it didn't work. There's a chapter in here about Stevie Wonder and the electrification of soul. The observation I think we can all make is that you listen to soul music, a lot of it is brass, it's orchestral, it's acoustic pianos. And then Stevie Wonder came along and he started using more synthesizers, Moog synthesizers, ARP synthesizers, and of course the clavinet. Stubbs takes the history of this right the way through to artists such as Beyonce and Janelle Monáe using more programmed beats that have been created by, Pro Tools and Logic. He draws an interesting parallel that most of us probably wouldn't draw between the cultural treatment of black people and the view of robots and technology, the view towards robots and technology. And his point is that particularly during segregation and the civil rights struggle, a lot of white people looked upon black people in a way that dehumanized them, and they carried out tasks for white people, and that's what they do. And that was kind of the attitude then, and that was kind of the attitude of how robots would work. So it's an interesting parallel to get your head round, but it does make some sense when you start thinking about it. So, Live Wires, a history of electronic music. The approach that this book takes is more of the technology itself. So each of the chapters in this book are dedicated to a form of music technology that developed over the past, say, 150 years is probably the sort of time frame we're looking at. So he starts with the tape recorder, he moves on to circuits, which predominantly include synthesizers but also include guitar amps. He then moves on to talk about turntable and record. So he talks about DJing, specifically big pioneers of DJing such as Kool Herc, Africa Bambaataa, Grandmaster Flash. But from that point onwards, he starts talking about more of the experimental take that people had with records, such as queuing up turntables at the same time to create a piece of music using sample libraries and sound effects and test discs. Then he goes on to talk about microphones and the development of microphones, the role that they played. And the last chapter, the longest chapter, of course, is about computers, which incorporates samplers, drum machines, all that kind of thing. Talking about circuits, he mentions a electric piano that was developed by a former army major called Harold Rhodes. And before joining the army, he had been a piano teacher. And he came back from war to find out that a lot of soldiers who'd been to war, some of whom were his students, they had lost limbs. And so they were now bedridden. and they still wanted to learn to play piano. So what he did is he designed a smaller style of piano that you could sort of put over your bed, rather like those tables that you get at hospitals. And he got investment from Leo Fender, and this was how the Fender Rhodes piano was born, and that was a solution to a problem. And that's really what a lot of technology in general has been. Most of the pioneers in these two books, particularly of the Avant-Garde and the music concrete, I hope I'm saying that right, my French isn't fantastic, but they faced criticism and disdain of, oh, well, is this music? You know, people would walk out of their installations and kick off, basically. There's an interesting experiment that is credited to Steve Reich, where what he did was he hung multiple microphones from the ceiling of a room. He turned the volume of the speakers all the way up and let the microphones swing back and forth and pick up the sound of their own feedback. And this sound was going in and out, back and forth. It was all going. I wonder how long I could have kept doing that. But the point is, it creates a rhythm. And, you know, this whole question of, what, is this music? If we look at the musical elements and you look again at that microphone experiment, it has a tempo because of the speed with which the microphone is swinging back and forth, and, the microphone slows down, so that decreases the tempo. You've got a pitch, which is obviously the pitch of the feedback, whether it's a high squeal or a low squeal, whichever. You've obviously got the duration, however long you do it for. The dynamics is in how close the microphone is to the sound source every time it swings back and forth. I could go on, but I think you get my point. That is, if we judge these experiments by our musical elements, then yes, it is music because it contains these elements by which we identify music. They do, as I say, feature a lot of overlapping, as the confusing titles might suggest. The really interesting overlap is Bing Crosby, who was recording his radio shows in the late 30s, early 40s live, and he wanted to be able to pre-record them so that he could cue them up, so that he could have more free time to make music, but also to play golf. And so what he did was he invested in the Ampex reel-to-reel tape recorder. He gave one to Les Paul and really just kick-started a revolution in people tape recording. And it's not just these two books either. You'll find Bing Crosby's name littered all over lots of books about music technology. And if that doesn't surprise you, it certainly surprised me. So, when comparing the two books, I would have to say that Mars by 1980, although detailed, it sometimes does contain a bit too much fluff and a bit too much filler. Whereas Live Wires, it kind of cuts right down to the gold a little bit better. And so to me, out of these two books, there is a clear winner. So I'm going to give David Stubbs' Mars by 1980 a 6 out of 10. And I'm going to give Daniel Warner's Live Wires an 8 out of 10. Thank you very much for watching. And remember, don't judge these books by their covers. Teachers, keep on teaching. Preachers, keep on preaching. World, keep on turning, and it won't be too long